Good afternoon. My name is Mariana Siciliano. I'm an assistant educator for public programs and engagement, and I'm really delighted to welcome you to Sunday at the Met today. As we were all taking our seats, we heard a sneak peek from the album called Milano. This is an album by composer and producer Daniele Lupi, and Daniele sourced much of his inspiration for his music from the work of Memphis Group, the famous design collective formed in Milan by Ettore Sottsass. So a great way to help us set the tone for today. Our program today is presented in conjunction with the exhibition Ettore Sottsass, Design Radical, on view at the Met Breuer through October 8th. The exhibition presents key works in a range of media, including his architectural drawings, interiors, furniture, ceramics, painting, photography, and more. We have the opportunity to celebrate the life and the work of Sottsass through a conversation with some of the most acclaimed designers working today: David Kelly, Joanna Grauender, and Peter Shire. David Kelly is the founder and chairman of the global design and innovation company IDEO, and the founder of Stanford University's Hasso-Plattner Institute of Design, known as the D School. Joanna Grauender is a designer and architect, and she worked with Sottsass as a partner at Sottsass Associati. Peter Shire is an artist, designer, and potter, and one of the members of Memphis Group. It really is an enormous thrill to have them with us today. Before we dive into our conversation, we'll take a closer look at some objects in the exhibition with Christian Larson. Christian is the Associate Curator of Modern and Contemporary Art and the curator of the exhibition. Please join me in welcoming Christian Larson.
Thank you very much, Mariana, for the lovely introduction, and to all of you for joining us on such a beautiful Sunday. When you could be outside, you're in here with us, so I really appreciate it. I wanted to walk you through a little bit about the exhibition first, in case you haven't had a chance to see it. The slides I'm about to show you are essentially my presentation to the exhibition committee here. This is how I pitched the show. So you'll see sort of the difference between the idea, the concept for the show, and then there's slides of the actual installation. So you'll see the reality of what the show became. I should start with Ettore himself. I never knew him. I was not so lucky. But I became fascinated with him while I was just a baby curator at the Museum of Modern Art. I was digitizing the entire design collection there, object by object, and his objects really leapt off the shelf at me. They had a personality all their own, and I didn't know enough about design then, but I could tell that there was some unique language binding them, and they intrigued me, they fascinated me. So any chance I got speaking with my mentors or professors, other designers, I would bring up Sottsass's name, and I was always surprised by a kind of negative reaction, at least here in the States. I think his reputation in Europe is something else, but here in the States, I would often be met by a kind of nod of recognition, but an arched eyebrow of questionable taste, tacky, 80s, fad, fashion. And that's because most Americans became aware of him in the 80s with Memphis. That was his real first international moment of fame. And he got sort of lumped in with postmodernism at that time. And postmodernism is on the losing side of art history. The modernists have sort of won, especially in architecture and design schools. So Bauhaus, form follows function. These are sort of the rules that we all follow. Sottsass didn't follow the rules. He was somebody who followed his curiosity. And I love this photo of him because it sort of shows him with goggle glasses he designed himself as a kind of visionary, looking into the future, but simultaneously smoking this puff of cloud coming out of him that sort of is the haziness of the past. And that became the concept for the show. So I wanted to set it up with this trio of objects and really kind of destabilize the traditional narrative that has Sottsass as an Italian designer, Milanese at his heart. Actually, he was born in Austria. His father was trained in the same pedagogy as Otto Wagner, the great modernist architect at the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna. And the Viennese and the Germanic had a very strong impact on Sottsass. He was looking at things like the Wiener Werkstätte, Bauhaus, and here Otto Wagner's chandelier from the Steinhoff Cathedral. If any of you have been to the Steinhoff Cathedral, you would have noticed that the entire building is a kind of study in golden dots and circles. And so I read his Sottsass's cabinet that's on the left there as a kind of homage to Wagner. So you have the past, Wagner influencing Sottsass, and then Sottsass influencing the present with this really kind of spectacular, over-the-top cathedral cabinet, which is basically Chartres Cathedral cast in bronze and turned on its side, literally upending an architectural icon. I asked Job Smeets, the designer of this cabinet, whether Sottsass was an influence on him, and he said absolutely. Sottsass for him was a hero in design school. He went to Eindhoven, which is perhaps the best design school today. And at Eindhoven, he said they taught Rietveld, which is the master modernist designer, Dutch designer, who was a colleague of Mondrian, this sort of de style constructivist movement. But they didn't teach Sottsass, and he gravitated towards Sottsass. He liked that kind of rebellious attitude, and I think a lot of young design students like that kind of rebellion. So, you know, Sottsass never knew Job, and Wagner never knew Sottsass, but these three exist in a continuum through time. There's a design lineage, and I felt the responsibility for this show to give you those lineages, the past influencing present with Sottsass, I suppose, and Sottsass influencing designers today. And this is how it looks in the exhibition at the entrance when you walk in. I couldn't get the chandelier. There's only 6. They're in the church. It would be irresponsible of me to borrow one, so I left them in the church. But you have a little kind of mock-up of images. As I mentioned before, Wiener Werkstätte and Bauhaus. We have beautiful objects in the collection. This show was done in very little time. It was kind of not foreseen to be done, actually, at all. So I had to slap it together, and I borrowed heavily from the collections here at the Met. This is in part why I wanted to include so much historical and ancient material, because we have it here. We have 5,000 years of art and design for me to draw from. So I set this up as a kind of Bauhaus and Wiener Werkstätte objects influencing Sottsass's, and then Sottsass influencing Peter Scheier, who we have here today. And this is how it looks in the galleries. I was surprised by how much these objects resonated with the building itself. I thought that this show would be a contrast and a fight between Breuer's version of high modernism. This building is the epitome of modernist thinking. It's austere, it's cool, it's rational, it's functional. Sottsass is anything but. He's emotional, he's playful, he's witty, ironic, and colorful. And in the end, I was surprised by how well the two things gelled. The architecture and the objects really started to speak to each other. The grid in Sottsass's work is the grid in the ceiling. And so you start to see Sottsass was a modernist at heart. He was trained in modernism, but he was the bridge into the postmodern. I didn't want to belabor his work with Olivetti because it's pretty famous, but I had to include the Valentine because it's such an iconic object. And I wanted to show its influence on designers today. Nicholas Negroponte in the MIT Media Lab designed the One Laptop Per Child, which was meant to be distributed for free to underprivileged children in underdeveloped nations. I think Sottsass had the same kind of utopian thinking when he was designing the Valentine. He meant for it to be at the very cheapest price point. He wanted anybody to buy this. He wanted it to be like Bic pens. That wasn't the way it worked out, and so there's a nice little expletive on my pedestal there about his disappointment with the design because he couldn't quite achieve in working with Olivetti the results that he wanted. I wanted to focus on some seminal projects that Sottsass designed, really visionary landmarks in his career, the first being the superbox. This is the first time the armoire or the closet gets removed from the wall and into the center of the space like a sculpture, like a totem. He was inspired by Parisian models wearing Pierre Cardin with their PVC, plastic, industrially produced materials. He said, these girls have already done to their bodies what I want to do to furniture. And so he clads his superboxes in these plastic laminates. The super box I see in a continuum of time with the ancient Egyptian shabti box as a forerunner. These were also sort of closets for the tools you needed in your afterlife, except they contained your slaves instead of your clothes. You have Moser's cabinet, again, Wiener Werkstätte, and Donald Judd. I felt really compelled to put Judd and Sottsass in the same room. The superbox and the vertical stack were designed within the same year of each other. So this minimalism is in the air, and it helps us question hierarchies between fine art and design. And here it is in the installation. The black and gray one is a prototype from which Sottsass chose the final design, which is the green and gray one. Sottsass was extremely spiritual. He went to India in 1961. He had suffered 3 deaths in his life. His best friend, Mario Chu, who was at Olivetti with him, they designed the first mainframe computer together. And his father died. I forgot who the third one was. But this was a kind of a moment where he's questioning his priorities in life. So he goes to India, and he sees these types of objects, linga, funerary markers, stupas, objects that have no other meaning other than to be kind of spiritual markers. They have emotional resonance. They mark lives. And this really changed his thinking, and we'll talk more about that later. But he responds by designing these menhirs, ziggurats, stupas, hydrants, and gas pumps, which is a kind of mix between those ancient objects and what he viewed as the contemporary colors of gas stations with gas pumps and these almost toxic yellows, caution tape yellows. He felt that those were the colors of his time, of the 60s. He would have been good friends with Ed Ruscha. And here it is in the installation. In India, he also finds objects that are meditational, both in their making but also in their viewing, like these cosmological diagrams, yantras and tantras, mandalas. He looks at those and then he abstracts them into his ceramic forms. So I have a display of these types of objects. He comes back from India after he sees these type of vernacular ceremonies where they're making offerings to Shiva, little clay linga, little phalluses that they would take to the river and offer to the god, and they would be washed away. When he comes back from India, it turns out that he has a very rare form of kidney disease, and he was dying. There was only one doctor in the world who could save him, so Roberto Olivetti paid for him to go to Palo Alto, Stanford, where he was brought back to life. But it took 2 years and a whole lot of medicine. He was very ill. During the course of the illness, he had a fever dream where he saw the phases of the moon, which you can see reflected in this ceramics of darkness on the left, on the yellow pedestals. He saw these moon-like forms, night, death, darkness, mortality, giving way to the sun, light, Shiva. And so he does these 2 ceramic series. On the left, the ceramics of darkness, a study in his mortality, and then on the right, those plates. He made 100 individual plates as an offering to Shiva for bringing him back to health. He took up glass very late in his career. In the 80s, really, he starts to take it on with some gusto in his first collection from Memphis. So I was looking at ancient predecessors, these types of Roman and Greek glass forms that I feel have an interesting relationship between form and decoration. You don't need all of those little filigree elements on the outside of those glasses. They're not structural, they're purely decoration. In fact, some of these objects make us question what we thought they were initially. The very tall one we used to think was for kohl, for painting your eyes, eye makeup. But actually now we think they're incense dispensers, that they would have been filled with oils and hung from the ceiling to perfume the room. And Sottsass has an interesting relationship to those objects as well. He sort of fractures them and decomposes them deconstructs them really into these various forms. So there's a relationship and not. A lot of it is a question of scale. Some of these objects are teeny tiny. They're thimble size. When you look at Sottsass's glass, they're kind of monumental. They command a room. And here you see them in their scale. this is one of the objects that I couldn't get, one of the few objects that are here at the Met in the Egyptian department that I was dying for. It's this pectoral necklace of Sitath or Unit. Literally, this object would have elevated her from mere royalty into deity with eternal life. It was a kind of blessing for eternal life. But it's such an important object, we couldn't risk it going over to Breuer. So it stays here. You can see it in the Egyptian galleries. But you can see the formal relationship between the two designs is very strong. Another room in the exhibition focuses on what I find to be his most visionary project, this modular system of cabinets that he called the environment. In 1972, he was asked by MoMA, Emilio Ambas was the curator, to participate in an exhibition which is still one of the most important exhibitions MoMA has ever done, called Italy, the New Domestic Landscape. He and a number of other Italian designers were asked to rethink the home. What is a home in 1972? Now that we're much more relaxed, loose, our social behaviors have changed, we don't have the same kind of formal, uptight situation that we used to, even in the 50s, which was much more coded and structured. And Sottsass gave us this, which is really radical. He breaks down the functions of the home, each into a cabinet. So one cabinet would have a toilet, another would have the sink, one would have a bed, one a table, chairs, etc. You could add or delete the functions as necessary. They were mobile and modular, so you could configure spaces using the cabinets. You could either lock out the world or keep it open and communal for everyone to use. And he really saw this as a communal project. This was something that was supposed to resist possession. You were not supposed to want to own this. It was made out of gray plastic by cartel. So, you know, you couldn't buy this. It was something that was, it was like porta potties, really. You could come in, you'd plug in, and you'd plug out. You would probably pay for the time that you use. So in some ways, I think he's predicting the sharing economy. We do this with cars now with Uber, but imagine if you could do this with a home. Next to it, I have a Memphis piece by Masanori Umeda, which is also rethinking the domestic landscape, a kind of conversation pit, which is a hybrid of the violence of the boxing ring, because sometimes language and conversations in a pit could be like a battle, but there's also the serenity of a tatami room and the tea ceremony. So the peacefulness of the East, the violence of the West come together in this really wacky Memphis piece. I also paired it with a Thomas Struth photo, which this is curatorial license. Sottsass had no relationship to Thomas Struth, but I felt that this photo brought people back into the equation. The show is so much about objects that we also need to understand that objects are only as good as the people who use them. And this environment here with this family of 4 in their Japanese traditional house is another way of looking at the domestic environment. And here it is in the installation. Unfortunately, I couldn't get the conversation pit come tatami room. It was meant to be in the center of this gallery, but for reasons that I can talk to you later about, it couldn't come. Architecture. I didn't want to belabor his architecture. I decided to include 2 projects, one built, one unbuilt and visionary. The visionary drawings are up at top there. Sottsass wanted to, in the 70s, there were few opportunities to build, so a lot of architects were so-called paper architects. They were just visionaries, and he, in this series of drawings, was looking at a kind of post-apocalyptic world where the structures that we have today are predicated on a society of labor and money. And he thought, well, what if we built a different world where the structures would be based on leisure and culture? What would that look like? So you end up getting structures like the one in the center there, with these rays coming out of the top. That was meant to be a dispenser for incense, marijuana, and LSD. So you hook up your hookah or your tent. There's a little Bucky Fuller dome over there in the drawing somewhere. He was really a provocateur. You know, he was making you question the values of society, and maybe he was a little bit hippie as well. The other drawing is temples of erotic dances. Here's one of the built projects, at least a couple of drawings. I apologize for the quality of the slides. We have better images now. But this is how I pitched it to the exhibition committee. Joanna Grouwunder actually worked on this project with him, and this was the first project where he felt he became a mature architect in 1986 to about 89, working with Daniel Wolf, a patron of this museum. And here you have the installation. I didn't foresee this section of the exhibition. I didn't pitch it because it occurred to me as I was planning this that a lot of what dignifies Sottsass and makes him unique is his relationship to color and pattern, and that color and pattern was fundamental to understanding Memphis. So I came up with this section here where I presented in distance. I wanted them to read almost like a flat juxtaposition of various colors and patterns all layered on top of one another. And then as you approach, they should start to dissolve into discrete objects, and you could look at them each individually. And that's a lot of what Memphis is about. It's about the skin of the objects. Sottsass felt that the skin was the site of sensual stimulation, that it's what you see first, it's what you touch first, and therefore he really paid a lot of attention to the skin of his objects with these various plastic laminates or textiles. All of these patterns were then used by all of the different Memphis members. They could take them or leave them as they wished and use them in their designs. So it was kind of an interesting palette off of which all of them worked. This became the hardest thing for me to figure out how to present in the exhibition, the Carlton Bookshelf /room divider / cabinet, or just sculpture. What is it exactly? But it's the icon of the Memphis group, without a doubt. To have an object like that, I thought, well, let's think about it in terms of function and non-function. Let's pair it with a sculpture, which is totally non-functional. It's a sculpture. This is George Sugarman's piece, but it's here in the Met's collection. It is radical. It's from the mid-'60s, and it needs a lot of conservation work. We couldn't get it fixed in time, so I wasn't able to show it. Therefore, this configuration was out. But I wanted non-function, quasi-function, and full function with Robert Venturi's chair. This also shows that Sottsass was using plastic laminates before Robert Venturi was. So then I came up with this configuration. I had been lusting after Pierre Paulin's bookshelf for the Élysée Palace in Paris for Georges Pompidou. He did all of these interiors in 1972. And I couldn't get that shelf either. So scratch that. In the end, I just put two Memphis pieces, the Carlton with Andrea Branzi's Magnolia bookcase, and I felt like they made a nice pairing all alone. It's kind of nice to see Mondrian in the background, too. I hadn't thought of the Carlton in relationship to Mondrian, that Mondrian was meant to be in relationship to those super colorful blocks, those volumes that you see there, the hot pink, yellow, and green, because that is Sottsass's homage to Mondrian. And then the show closes with pairings. I felt like Sottsass's late work was never really understood or appreciated, so I wanted to compare him to four 20th century masters. Jean-Michel Franck, in this case. I love this pairing because they're almost exact inverse objects, one from the other, where Jean-Michel Franck is absolute minimalism in structure, Sottsass is complexity. Where Jean-Michel Franck is about the luxuriousness of the veneer, of the skin. He famously used shark skin, mica, straw. In this case, in the exhibition, it's flower ash, which is a very expensive burl wood, very rare. And it makes his objects absolutely, they were only made for the very wealthiest people. Sottsass uses the most banal, low-cost skins. He uses plastic laminate and engineered plywood. So, but he makes it look really expensive and visually exciting. So I love how these two objects interface with each other. Another master of the 20th century, Negroponte and Fornasetti. I'm wearing Fornasetti tie today in homage. Ponti was a mentor to Sottsass. Sottsass was a prisoner of war at the end of World War II. Italy had switched sides from the Axis to the Allies, and Sottsass was on a train heading back home. He was fighting for the Axis, but they switched sides, and so the Germans boarded the train and took all of the Italians prisoner. So he was kept in Croatia for, I understand, something like 3 months with nothing but raw onion to live on. When he gets out of prison and back to Milan, there's no work. Italy is war-torn. The economy is nothing. And Ponti is the first one to approach Sottsass and give him a job, which is Domus magazine, which Ponti was the director of at the time. And he asked Sottsass if he would write essays. It's those essays that I used as the basis for all of my selections. So, a few places I picked objects that I used my license, but most of them are substantiated in Sottsass's own writings or interviews with him. So this wasn't arbitrary, it was based in scholarship. And I love this pairing here of the sort of architecture of each object. Sottsass's I interpreted as a medieval tower for a Rapunzel. Somebody in a tour recently told me that the base of the bed was like Rapunzel's hair coming out of the tower. And I have to agree. And there they are in the show. Shiro Kuramata was another one of the 20th century masters, and the two of them were great friends until Shiro died. The two of them, there's a history of letters that they send back and forth. They almost read like love letters. They're extremely poetic, and their production also reads like a game of friendship. Sottsass would produce something, Shiro would produce something almost in counterpoint or as a call and response. And so they did that throughout their careers. In fact, this Mondrian, I think this really shows Sottsass's genius. Kuramata also produced a cabinet in homage to Mondrian, but Kuramata's version was a literal transposition of the grid onto the front of a cabinet. Some of the sections opened, some of them don't. Sottsass really reinterprets Mondrian into 3 dimensions with this composition of volumes, and instead of this red, green, blue RGB color palette, he makes it CMYK. It couldn't be more contemporary. And here's an installation shot. And that was the show. So I love this last statement by Sottsass. I think that it really sums up his attitude about design and life. So with the exhibition there, I'd like to invite my guests up to the stage, David, Joanna, and Peter. So I never knew him, but these 3 knew him very well, and they knew him in various stages of his career. So I thought I would start by asking them, since we're all Californians, I grew up in LA, Peter's in LA, Joanna and David are up in the Bay Area. California seemed to be really important to Sottsass. It had an impact on him. It's where he literally was brought physically back to life, as well as spiritually, I think. He spent 2 years there rehabilitating from his illness, and during that time he fell in with the Beats. His wife, Fernanda Pivano, introduced him to Hemingway, to Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, Bob Dylan. This is a photograph that Sottsass took himself hanging out with these guys. So I wondered, given that relationship and given that place, did Sottsass ever talk to you about his time in California or what California meant to him? Whoever wants to begin.
My story is short. My contact with Ettore was orbital. And I'd come in and do the work that we did and kind of bump against him. And I, sort of like Halley's Comet. So I kind of think of it as Peter's Halley's Comet. But he, Joanna and David really worked with him so that the comments are different. And he made a comment that one time, and this picture is perfect for it, Bob Dylan came in, and all these guys were there at a Chinese restaurant, and they were completely overwhelmed by Dylan's presence. Did you ever hear that from him? Yeah. And I always thought that was part of the reason he named it Memphis, because he's really wanted to co-opt that power.
So his relationship to Dylan went back to the 60s. He was on his mind, and it wasn't just a fluke that the song was playing while Memphis...
Maybe.
Yeah, it could have been just chance as well,
Yeah.
but...
Apocryphal.
I think Ettore really noticed the weather in California. I think if you live in Milan where it's sometimes too hot and sometimes too cold, and in Northern California it's mostly more temperate. But he talked to me a lot about, because I'm a Stanford professor, have been for 30 years, he was in the Stanford Hospital. He was in room 128, east wing of the hospital, room 20. And I made a pilgrimage there to see, it's still there, east 128 is still there. And there, together with Ferlinghetti, he wrote books. There's a series of books where Ettore did the illustrations and Ferlinghetti did the poetry. And so they're fantastic. They're kind of, paperback kind of things. But anyway, and so fast forward to when Ettore designed a house with me, he really, since he'd been there in the 60s, he really knew he knew the climate.
Yeah.
And so he was very effusive about how much he enjoyed being back and feeling, that kind of thing. And then we can talk about it later, but I mean, he had a funny, because we're talking about Silicon Valley when you're talking to me about Northern California. And so, he had to kind of have a love-hate relationship with technology. And so that was also a part of California. But I think he had a real fondness for Stanford and for Palo Alto, maybe because, your life has been saved by these doctors, so, you might have a little bit of a positive feeling. But he had a very positive feeling towards California, especially because people let their ideas fly there, more easily, and that was him, right? So he felt totally at home, stating his opinion and arguing with everybody, that we were all wrong and that he was right. And that kind of stuff.
Joanna?
So mine's a little different because I thought that he recognized before most Californians that there's actually two, there's the northern and the southern. And my experience with him was actually the Southern California because we had a couple projects in LA. We did a gallery on Rodeo Drive, so we were there a lot. And what I got from him was seeing California through an Italian's eyes, but not just any Italian, a very sensorially in-tuned Italian. So for me, it helped me, even in my own work, to kind of mine my own past and not have to be the normal expat that's sort of trying to get away from your tradition. Instead, I would see that, wow, Southern California, freeways and all the sun, and we would rent a convertible and drive around, and so for me it was this very joyous view that he had of California, and one of his best friends also was there, Max Palevsky, so that helped to keep bringing him back.
A lot of his patrons, a lot of his work was in California, and it seemed to be, I always, coming from there and living on the East Coast, I think of California now as a place where there's a lot of experimental architecture, people aren't afraid to take risks. Here it's all a bit more circumscribed, it's a bit, but there's a culture of freedom, I think. So I wondered if that appealed to him.
The other thing you as New Yorkers don't necessarily know is that there was always a northern-southern rivalry, and actually Northern California tried to secede from Southern California 2 times in the state Senate.
But Northern California has all the water, and Southern California has all the votes.
Yeah, well,
they need each other.
At that time, Northern California had the commerce too. They had the shipping and banking.
Yeah.
And LA is really a post-war development.
Before he got to California, though, he was in India. And I think this is another place where he really had a kind of life-changing experience. He continued to go to India throughout his life. And there he found something very different from what he experienced in the States. His first time that he came to the United States was in '56 with Fernanda Pivano again. She was here in order to interview and get to know American writers, Hemingway above all, but many others included. And so Sottsass, the newlywed, was like, okay, well, I guess I'm coming with you. I met George Nelson the year before, so I guess I'll work in George Nelson's office for 3 months. And he and George Nelson had it seems weird, I can't see those two personalities together, but they really loved each other for the rest of their lives. So they spoke fondly of one another. And so when he's in New York for those 3 months with Nelson, he's totally impressed by the United States in the 50s, we're in a boom economically. We're building cookie-cutter houses in suburbs. We're mass-producing cars. And this sort of technologically advanced civilization couldn't have been more different from war-torn Italy, which was also trying to make strides and make a comeback, but in a very different way from the United States. But here, the flip side to all of this mass production was that there was mass consumption of all the same things, and it was leading to a culture of sameness, and he felt it was even alienating this kind of mass production, mass consumption. In India, he found the flip side to that, a kind of poverty of objects, but the objects they had were loved. There was almost a spiritual connection to them. So with India, he comes up with these totems, which are right when I think while he's on his deathbed in Palo Alto, you see this totem of all of the liquids and pills he has to take every day to bring him back to health. He's thinking about the totem as something that means something spiritually, as a marker, a human marker. And then in '67, he realizes this exhibition of all of the ceramic totems. And for me, this project sort of summarizes that shift in his thinking, that he went from being trained towards mass production into objects that had a different kind of meaning, that were injected with a soul, with emotion, with other functions beyond the pragmatic and the physical. And I wondered what you all thought about this aspect of his career, the place of India, and how it shaped this kind of thinking. Did he speak about India to you?
Yeah, he spoke constantly about India, and I think that I'd say the main thing that I understood that he took from it was this kind of poetic softness of everything, but also the tragedy that you see everywhere. So it was very much you're seeing the best and the worst of humanity, pretty much. A couple times we went with specific projects in mind. One of them was photographing Hampi, which as an architecture student from the West, I didn't even know what that was, because we knew all about the Acropolis and you study ancient ruins, but in the middle of India, there's this amazing, ruined city, quite intact actually, and people are still sort of living there. They're making their own lives within these temples and things like that, just sort of squatting in there. So Ettore went there to photograph this, and what was really interesting was to just see how deep into the level of detail. The architecture wasn't anything like what he was doing. He was almost looking at the architecture as if they were objects, which is a discussion between the architecture and his object work that you'll probably address. But he would, zoom into a tiny little carving or zoom into a tiny little column articulation. And this was just this, pure curiosity to see what was going on here. And this is probably already the 25th time that he'd ever been to India. So always discovering new things. Also totally courageous. No fear of barging into someone's house and taking kind of take a picture or, and end up everybody's hugging. And yeah, very, very generous as well. In that sense. He ate, yeah, see, he would eat everything that they offered him.
Never got sick?
Never got sick. Didn't drink while he was there. That probably helped.
When Ettore came for his last show into LA, he spoke at the Getty, and his lead was, the curator asked him about his time with George Nelson and America. And he said the thing that struck him about America at that time was nobody talked about death. And in Italy, everybody constantly talked about death.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm not sure I can follow a discussion of death with anything enlightening, but the totems really kind of were important to Ettore and to throughout his work, and especially Christian talked about the show in '72 in MoMA, where he did these, this was like science fiction predicting the future, and it's held true all these years. And so he continued to use those kind of totems and boxes and stuff that are in the show, even to the point my house was built in about 2000, and the house is full of these, like in the middle of nowhere, these boxes.
boxes, yeah.
And it's what most people react to. What's, like, when are you going to move these to where they're supposed to be? They're bolted to the floor, with lights, plumbed in, exactly, with lights there. And Ettore many times would say something that kind of resonated with me, but I wasn't sure it was true, and then it came out to be true. He was so wise. I mean, I'm sure obviously, it was, you had the feeling that you were around greatness. You were in the presence of greatness. I mean, it sounds dramatic, but that's really how I felt. And when you were with him, especially alone on a train coming back from Venice or something, there was just something about him. And it was partially because of how wise he was. And so he would say to me, I would complain about, why do you have all these random boxes in my house breaking up the space? And he would say something, it was always human-centered. Everything he said would come true with respect to how people really would relate to things, the height of something or how wide it was or a color. It wasn't like he was an artist exclusively saying, here's my idea, you should like it. He understood how people react. So with me, when I complained about these boxes in the middle of nowhere, he said, look, people, they're human scale. If you look at the boxes, there's something they're about the size of a human, about the height, about the width. And he said, this will make people more comfortable in your house. I mean, when people come, they will stand next to one of these boxes like it was their friend. He was, I mean, maybe the introverted ones in particular, but he was absolutely right. I mean, the kind of things he would say like that. The other thing he would say, I'm way off the subject here, but the other thing he would say, I'd go on these bird walks that make nothing to do with what I'm supposed to talk about. But anyways, he told me, put the bed in the center of the room. Why you push the bed against the sidewalk? And they showed the bed with the Rapunzel hair in front of it. That bed should be in the center of the room. You can tell. You shouldn't jam that against the side of the wall.
I had to bring it out as much as I could, but the platform was too
Anyway,
skinny.
so my bed, he said, it's the throne, put it in. Anyways, and I would never push a bed anywhere in a room other than in the center. And it's just his sensitivity and the reaction to people in India and his humanness was quite extraordinary.
Actually, we'll stay on this for a second. I wanted to talk about your favorite objects of Ettore's, starting with my favorite, which I've already waxed poetic about it, the environment from MoMA. This I find to be absolutely brilliant and visionary and way ahead of its time. There's some stills from the film that accompanied it, and the film is in the show. Which is pretty wacky and full of leftist politics from Italy, post-Paris 1968. But I wondered, what are your favorite objects by Ettore? And you all sent me some slides. I wanted to start with, I wanted to get David's read on some drawings that Ettore did in 2000 where he predicts fake news. This is called Electronic Instruments for the Production of the Ego. He says, during the next millennium, democracy, will reach the maximum point of freedom. Everybody will be able to do whatever he wants. The fundamental and only production will be the production of the ego. Therefore, a system of little boxes, which are only approved by marketing to be in black or AT&T white, no colors. And these boxes are for the production of self-made planetarian news as one likes them. It could even produce seasons as you want them or design them. So what does this, given that you designed a telephone with Ettore and you were already dealing with this kind of telecommunications, IDEO very much is involved with this type of production.
Well, you realize Ettore's making fun of us in particular in this drawing, the drawing. Yeah, as I said before, he has a funny relationship with technology where it's fascinating because he has such what they call a growth mindset. His mindset is so open to what's next and to learn, and he was a lifelong learner in that way. That he kind of liked the idea that technology was predicting the future, but it was so inhuman compared to his life. I mean, lunch was a lot more important than an iPhone to Ettore, for sure, right? And so this, I think he's poking fun. And he's trying to show that, that there is even with these little black boxes with the lines, there's still an exciting, visceral, human future out there. And the Internet of Things. This is the Internet of Things,
Internet
right?
of Things.
Internet of Things, but Internet of Things not where you're not talking about the technology, but you're talking about the human aspects that might be empowered by this. And so
Exactly.
I think he liked technology, and that he could dream of a world that was quite different from the present world, which he liked to talk about a lot. His visionariness. And so the technology thing was just a possibility that could fuel his view of the future of all things human, religion, politics. I mean, you didn't sit with him very long before there was a big discussion about politics, and everybody's yelling at everybody else. And John and I were talking about this. It's funny that Italians are a little different than me, at least, or the Americans, and there'd be a big fight. Remember this? A big fight. It's all about positive. And I thought they all hated each other. And the next morning, they're all like having breakfast, like friends.
Or even the next minute.
Anyway, so.
There's another one from the series of drawings where he just presents us with a blank screen or billboard. In the year 2004, Sottsass designed a surface without advertisements, now called information. On that surface, there are no naked girls, no politicians, portraits, no stock exchange numbers, no condoms, no shampoos, no South Seas. There is nothing. For this blasphemous design, Mr. Sottsass risked prison.
We see these on a little screen up there. You may not know
Yeah,
that.
that's why I had to read it for you.
Yeah,
'cause-
and so they're kind of small and blurry, and they really look a lot like the old cartoons from the 20s to me. Like Smokey Stover and the Cats and Jammers, especially the other one with the window and.
Yeah. Peter, this was your favorite Sottsass object.
Oh yeah, this was our test. Did you see it?
Yeah, it's beautiful.
Yeah, you've never seen it before, right?
It's Blumhelmann, isn't it?
Yeah, but it's two of them together. Because I could never decide which one I liked more. So,
Bolted them together?
yeah. Yeah, and so, I was thinking about them, the question was asked, and I saw these things in my memory, this thing, and I went back to the catalog, and I couldn't find it, and I realized that I'd put two of them together in my mind. So with computers, now we put the two of them together, and we sent them to Christian to see if he'd notice.
And I said, I've never seen this one before. I think I've seen it before, or I've seen parts of it, but never this. What's going on?
And part of the reason they're a favorite to me is because this came right at the end of the Memphis experiment, and it really seemed to be a refined synthesis using materials that he not only had discovered during that time, but ones that he couldn't quite use. It has a fineness that the other pieces don't. It veers away from the pop commercial aspect of Memphis, and it really shows what he's doing.
Blumhelmann was a great, and the party afterward was pretty good too.
Yeah, the party. I got in the cab with him and Barbara, and he said, "Oh, that was a terrible party." And I said, "Why not?" And he said, "They didn't have any pasta." And I said, "But they had a salmon. They had this fantastic, really big salmon." And he said, "Salmon's a stupid fish." And I said, I said, "But they swim upstream to mate, to show their diligence, right?" And he said, "Yes, that's what I mean. They're stupid." So things went like that.
Joanna, you sent me a couple of things as your favorite, this being one of them, the Tartar console.
Yeah. So Peter liked the Blumhelmann because I think right after the Memphis. For me, this piece is the last hurrah of Memphis. So it was in, I think, the last collection of Memphis. And suddenly you see that nothing's symmetrical anymore. There's really nothing to do with postmodernism at this point. It starts to look very architectural and very much like the architecture that then happened in the course of the next years coming up. I also just think it is actually a functional object. David has it in his house even. I don't know if you use it or not. Do you use it?
Yeah,
Okay.
I do.
Yeah. So I liked that he's taking the scale. You could put little cars there and it would seem like a building. You could have it, be small. It could be some kind of ceramic. So for me, this was his last final Memphis.
Mm-hmm. I also wanted to include, you said the Wolf House was your favorite. And
Yes.
was this the first project that you worked with Ettore on?
Yeah, so this is the big one, actually, for me, because so we did a lot of projects together, a lot of houses together as well. But, so you shouldn't really pick a favorite. It's like picking a favorite child.
Yeah.
But I'm going with the firstborn, which was actually the Wolf House. And what happened in the Wolf House was it had developed, at that point we had worked for a few years on all these Esprit showrooms. So that was already a 3D, larger scale interpretation of what Memphis was doing and what Ettore's whole career had come. By the time he had this commission from Daniel Wolf to design an entire house from the ground up, which was the first one he'd done in, I think, 45 years, he was bringing all of that into the table. So he was trying to bring it from Memphis, but at the same time, developing an entire new language that then eventually ended up becoming the language of the architecture for the next 15 years that he
Right.
worked on, I think. So this one, you have no idea the amount of human energy that went into this house as far as, we designed the hell out of that thing. Every single detail, every single piece of furniture, everything's custom. Everything was made in Italy and sent over,
Wow.
which
okay.
is incredible.
I didn't realize that.
6 Italian little workmen wearing, slippers, because the Americans wear work boots, but the Italians wear slippers when they come in. Everything's pre-made, and they lived on site for 6 weeks and made pasta for lunch every day and installed all this furniture that we had designed. So this is extremely detailed from what you see in these sketches, which in reality it's very similar to the very first sketches, which is interesting.
It ended up being like, I wanted to actually walk through the sketches, because this is the preliminary concept.
Yes.
From what I understood from Danny Wolf,
Uh-huh.
who gave us the drawings, and he commissioned the house for himself in Colorado. It's on this mountainous site, supposedly spectacular, thousands of feet up in the air. And from this first sketch, I was wondering, why is there a naked lady at the bottom of the drawing? And Danny told me, oh, well, Ettore knew that I was a bachelor at the time and that this would be my kind of bachelor pad, and it was a way of getting chicks. So he drew in this girl to kind of seduce me into picking him as the architect.
Yeah, the dog would have been a lot cheaper for Daniel, so he probably should have done that.
Yeah, so I have to say that my house was done in a similar way, where the stuff was designed and built in Italy and then shipped and stuff. But the same workmen who came to do Daniel's house came to my house, and they show up, and they have these suitcases they're like the tan with this brown stripes, from the 50s. And a lot of suitcases. I said, why do you have so many suitcases? Pasta. They brought their own pasta.
And olive oil.
And olive oil, because you can't get it in the U.S., right? I eventually took them to North Beach, Italian part of it, and they eventually agreed that we did have most of it. But they had a whole list of things that we didn't have, that they had to bring with them when they go to a job. It was hilarious.
This is the next drawing in the Wolf House drawings.
Yeah. So I'm not sure the timing of, do you know the timing of these drawings, if they were actually
Yeah, this
first,
one's
second?
86 as well. So I think all of the 3 that we just saw were early.
Yeah.
It evolved past this, for sure.
So,
And then this is this was like the final executed version of the house. And
Yeah.
your name is on this drawing, actually. You signed your name to it as well.
yeah, because I did it.
Because you did it. Yeah, this is Joanna's drawing.
Sorry.
And here's the final built. I hate this picture, and this is the only published picture of this house with the crates out in front of it, and the landscaping's not done.
Yeah, too bad we don't know the guy who owns this house.
I've asked him actually if he would think about doing a whole new suite of photos now that the house is on in some years and it's fully mature. I want to see what it looks like now. He said, well, you can come and see it. Come and fly out to Colorado. I'll show it to you. I said, yeah, but everybody else wants to see it too. But you have to respect his privacy. But it's a beautiful house.
Soon after that red thing exploded.
Yep.
Into little tiny pieces.
There was
Really?
a gas leak, and apparently it actually popped off intact and fell over. That's what they said.
I had no idea.
So very plastic.
And now it doesn't want to go forward either. So speaking of the Wolf House, I thought we'd show some of your house, David.
Yeah, no, it's, as I said before, my house is much quieter than Daniel's. Was my house kind of the last house in the U.S. for sure. Last one, I think. Anyway, it's quieter. I mean, I think that was kind of as much about me as it was about Ettore. But I'll tell one story if you show the front again.
Yeah, you want the front?
Yeah,
Okay.
I would like the front.
The entrance. Oops, sorry.
Yeah.
There we go.
So Ettore really didn't like that American houses were, especially in this part of the country, kind of showed off your wealth. You know, the house said, "Look at me," right? And he wanted the house to say, "This is a private house, but you're welcome." So it's kind of obvious, but the house is kind of plain, and then there's this portico or whatever you want to say that welcomes you to the house. But I was friends with Robin Williams, and Robin would ride by all the time and come up to the house. When he came to the house, he turned into Ettore right away. He knew Ettore because we'd traveled together, and he turned into Ettore. You know, you can picture Robin Williams with an Italian accent, pretending he's Sottsass and stuff. Anyways, and so the house, it's not really apparent here, but the house goes on to the left in that brown brick for a long way. And so he would always talk about how his inspiration for my house was a freeway wall. Mm-hmm. She may have been, I don't know if she's sitting there, but she may have been there when Robin came by and said that one time. But anyways, the house is very plain from the front. He also said Americans are so stupid they featured the garage in their house. And I can't stop noticing that when I drive around, that the big mass in the front of the house is this 2-car garage, like presented to you like it's the most important part of the house. So anyway, so there were lots of things that Ettore did that were different. But I'll say just quickly that he really understood the inside outside. So this house is a bunch of different pavilions, 6 different pavilions, and each room has its own associated terrace. So there's an inside room and an outside room, and they're all tied together by this glass atrium. So a little village, and his point was that you have different emotions. You know, why should it all be the same? And each room in each building is made out of a completely different material. Some are shingles, some are stucco, bronze. I mean, it's like the whole thing is, he's just trying to show there's lots of different emotions. The contractor constantly tried to figure out how to take the drawings and extend the lines out and find out there was some vanishing point that made the whole thing rational. The reason that it was all at these weird angles was because there was some rationale with a point way out here. Ettore would have been really pissed off if he'd have been able to figure out some rationale, because it was the opposite of that. But anyways, you can see in these kind of pictures, you can see his kind of the beauty of his kind of point of view in the furniture in the house.
This barrel vaulted ceiling is so gorgeous with the light streaming
Sometimes,
through.
but
These teal colors.
Did
you say blue was your favorite color, or he just...
No. Oh, I didn't get to say much at all about this house, right? Just so you know, like the Meister was not consulting me much in the building of this house. But he said, one of my favorite things is, he said, so I don't think Ettore had any children. Ettore didn't have any children. But he said to me, I had a daughter, and he said to me, there's the bed in the middle of the room. He said, if I was a kid, I wouldn't want my own room, I'd want my own house. Anyway, so my daughter Clara has her own house, and he kept saying to me, like that game. I couldn't understand what he was talking about. And eventually we figured out he was talking about Monopoly. So I don't know, there's a picture, but her house is this little detached little greenhouse with the green roofing and the green siding are the same exact material, and it just goes up over there. And it's basically got no windows in it. And so anyway, so
here are the little boxes you were talking about before.
Yeah.
The human-sized boxes that are just sort of
you can
scattered
see those.
around.
And you look, they're just different. They have a different laminate that he had made exclusively for this, which was about looking like Japanese rice paper. But I mean, if you look at those boxes and then walk through the show, you see, like from 1972, you see a box every so many years that came into those, and it's the same point of view, and it just works. That's all I can
Box
say.
after box. And then from your house to Peter's house.
Much different production.
Yes, this is your own design, not Ettore's design.
Well, it's that too, but basically this is a house that was remodeled in about 1984, and I was working on the LA Olympics at that time, so the lamps got in there. And the thing about this house is that it's the most lackluster stucco supposed bungalow. You know, that bungalow really was
it's
a
like
craftsman, but we call everything a bungalow.
LA 1930s bungalow.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it was great. The records show that it cost $3,700 to build in the late 30s. And so my approach is completely different. There's no architectural modification of the building, structural, only stuff added onto it. And I think, within the room, there's a fireplace that's added on. The only thing that was changed really was we put sort of a visual communicating window as you walked in, because Matteo had walked in and said, "Oh, you should put a window here." And then I told Marco, and he says, "Yeah, he puts a window everywhere." And so I thought, oh, God, I thought he was just thinking of me. And so this, I think, became very popular because it looked like you could do it yourself. All you need to do is change the accessories.
What's on the right of the screen? The little purple feet. Is it a wall?
Yeah.
A screen?
Yeah, that's my tower.
That's your tower.
Yeah, and I wanted it to walk around, as you can see. I saw it on First Dibs recently. That tells you something. Right? So it's like aging or something. Anyway, and it's a tower with these impossible drawers. They're very long and thin.
Huh. Interesting.
Yeah.
They're on the edge there of the tower.
Yeah. Well, you can see the tower actually goes back. It's probably about 30 or 35 inches deep, and they come out of the front. So it's sort of a Monopoly house obelisk on caterpillar feet. Yeah, and then this is the bathroom, which was again the minimum bathroom. It was 8 by 5 is the smallest bathroom you can make in California. Yeah, and it's like 8 by 5, big enough for the tub but length, and I knew I'd done a good job because Tin Street Porter spent hours trying to figure out how he could get his camera in there, and and so I did this massive tile job on it that I'm my best client.
What are those tiles? They look almost like obsidian or glass
Well,
block.
they're low fire ceramic, and
It's a ceramic.
and a lot of them are hollow, so that they're volumes. And then the kitchen, at that time, everybody was really cooperative, and Formica gave me a ton of color core, and so the kitchen is all inlaid color core, and again, we were, really Dr. Caligari with the thing.
German expressionism,
Oh, yeah.
reinterpreted California style.
Oh yeah,
And I wanted to talk about Sottsass's influence on your own work. And I would start with Joanna. I picked a number of slides of pieces that you've made. Your work seems to be very much interested in light and lighted objects, lighted spaces, much more so than Ettore in a way. In fact, I don't think I put any of his lamps in the exhibition. I almost did, but it didn't fit with the concept of the past and the future, blah, blah, blah. So, what is it about light?
What is it about light? So I got interested in lighting because no one in the studio cared that much about what was happening in the architecture. So we worked with some really amazing consultants who did all the integrated lighting for the architecture. But at a certain point, I sort of started taking that on. But most of the stuff that comes out in my furniture is more coming out of what I was telling you before, the influence of Ettore helping me kind of see my roots from a distance. And that was this California freeway, billboard, almost kind of a pop culture hardware store sort of Southern California thing that then I saw later on from a Milanese point of view. So I started working with light. I started working with colored light because, as you saw with Peter's house, anyone that touched Ettore became a color person and couldn't do the white thing very easily. And found that with colored light, I could get a material that didn't have to be a surface. So I was trying to get color without having to use surfaces. And I have to say, that's also a reaction to Ettore because he was such a master of the surface, as you said in your opening remarks, that it was very difficult at that point to try to do anything new with a surface. It had kind of been done already. So for me, I thought, well, I'll just sort of avoid that problem, as well as formal problems, because my work also isn't that, crazy formally. It's quite minimal
more
in a certain way.
Minimal in a way.
Yeah, and then get the color through the light.
And here you're coloring a building through the lights.
Yeah.
This is also beautiful, this pool.
Yeah, that's an underground swimming pool in Geneva.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah,
These
so
lights.
so no fear of colors, no fear of fluorescence, and also no fear of doing the color in a different way. So Ettore used, as you know, when he did his glass pieces, and he wanted to like hang things on or do these kind of constructions that weren't possible, at a certain point he just said to the artisans, just glue it.
Glue it, yeah.
And that for the Murano guys was, they really had a problem with it. But if you take that spirit, then you can also paint steel with just acrylic wall paint, like is what that is. And you don't have to worry about it being anodized or being, and this kind of freedom of materials, freedom of method even, process. Yeah, that's all coming from that experience, I think.
There's something very Californian about it too. I don't like Robert Irwin dealing with lighting, or James Turrell.
Yeah.
These kind of spaces that are essentially light
Yeah, sure.
and color.
True, masters all,
Bow down.
but honestly, when I started this, I didn't know it that well, that stuff. So kind of discovering the same root, it's the same roots in a way, So trying to discover this same sort of almost ready-made, high-low sort of dialogue going on in a minimal way with a natural language that felt good to me, but then having the influence coming from the Milanese design. And this is at
This is
at
here
the
in New
Museum
York.
of Museum of Art and Design on the 7th floor of the restaurant. So again, color. So ceramics, that's a tough one if you're coming out of Sottsass, or if you're a person in the 20th century, because, as Ettore wrote in the show, you trace the history of ceramics as almost, right at the beginning of humanity.
Yeah.
So the idea there was just to figure out what's something that I could do that after the apocalypse, someone found a shard of my ceramics, how would they be able to date that? And that just turned out to be fluorescent acrylic paint. So that's what that is as well. Yeah, hopefully that won't come sooner rather than later. I don't know.
Reminded me of BBPR. There's some lights that are very popular right now on the market that look a lot very similar to this.
But this was designed, that's very true. And this was designed instead for a jewelry designer in Paris named Lorenz Baumer. And unfortunately, I'm not wearing the ring. This is my ring, but I'm not wearing his ring. We traded a lamp for a ring, and his ring looked kind of like that. And in the little holes are jewels. So I thought, that wouldn't he love this light if it looked like his work? And in fact, he did. So that's where that's coming from. Yeah. Okay. And then this is Arte Povera meets, low budget. It was a commission to do the lighting for the interior of the Museum of Contemporary Art in Syracuse, Sicily. And they had no money and just trying to figure out what to do. So in the end, I was experimenting again with fluorescent paint and ended up painting these ancient walls, which they let me paint in fluorescent paint, and hitting it with black light. So you got this kind of projection effect. So it was a more conceptual project, but yeah, color.
More color.
Yeah, again, same thing, working with low, cheap materials like linoleum. And then, hey, David, that's what I was talking about for your floor. Sorry.
You're designing something together?
Yeah. And this is an earlier, so we've kind of gone backwards in time, but this was an earlier show that I did at Alberto Albrici's gallery. Peter also works for, and he was one of the original Memphis guys. And this was the first attempt by me to try to bring integrated lighting out of architecture into an object type thing. So these were objects, you'd order them and have it be the size that you wanted, floor to ceiling or whatever. But they would seem like architectural elements. Oh, you got a lot of them in here. Okay.
Yeah, I thought I'd give a nice range of your projects.
Okay. This is in Tokyo. So it's urban furniture in Tokyo. There's this, in Roppongi, there was a series of urban pieces done throughout Roppongi area in Tokyo, and they asked Sottsass, and they asked Marcel Wanders and Mark Newsom and Patricia Urquiola. And Patricia and I were the only women, and this was my piece. It was near a school for small children. So the idea was the little tiny kids didn't really have anything to play on because they were too small. So I thought I would do a series of benches where the little kids could do like the learning to walk thing, where they'd like, use it to kind of pull up.
As a prop. Yeah.
Exactly. And then there's all these different surfaces that they can walk on, so sort of learn to navigate.
And Peter, let's talk about Ettore's
can
influence
opener.
on you, and
Oh, yeah.
this in particular, which is in the show,
Yeah,
the
I
Mexican
think,
Bauhaus can opener.
I'm sure, speaking for all of us, it's omnipresent. And yeah, I had a great moment where it became very practical. And I was in Tokyo. Actually, I was in Sapporo. I'd gone through, and I was designing this piece for Sapporo Beer, a sculpture. And the president of the company had told me he wanted it to be more something. And I said, more Zen? And he said, no, not Zen. Because I realized that's a completely different thing. But it was this very ephemeral sort of description. So I had to run back to the apartment, to the hotel, and I bought art supplies, and I was drawing all night, and I was watching Japanese porn. Which is pixelated. So the things kept getting more and more complicated. And I was going, no, what am I doing? And about 3 in the morning, I said, what would Ettore do? And I really said this. And he said, I'd go out and find some women. No, after all that. And but really, I remember working along with Aldo. Aldo was doing a front for one of the spree shops, and Ettore came along and he said, just do this and do that. You ever have those moments with him? Yeah, I mean, he could just spot it, right? And he just simplify it, take all the complication out. So I just sort of said, well, he came along and he went like that. And I drew this piece, and it was it. I went to bed. And so the next morning, we went into the room, and the first meeting had been with like 40 people from all over Japan, lighting people and everything. Did you ever go through any of those? Yeah, they'd all fly in. It was really weird. And so that was just with the president and my design company that was managing me. And I had it worked up where I showed the first ones I did, and you could see their faces just drop. And then did the last one, and they all, that's it. And everything was fine again. So working with him. But, on something like this, California was up to a different kind of thing, and we were making everything as absurd and as almost nonsensical. It's really typified by Wet magazine and our interest there. So this thing with this canted front to be the spout instead of a spout, and then I don't know. I hear that there are people that were born in the year 2000. Are any of you here today? And And so, we used to get cans of beer or cans of beans or whatever it was, and we got a can opener. It's called a church key. It had a little pointed thing and a hook, and you'd make this pointed triangular opening. There it is on that piece. Yeah, that's hence the can opener. And then and then of course, that I couldn't stop there. And the way that you load the tea in is through this sort of partition where I don't know how the hell you do it. But you could imagine it. And so we'd use that as the justification. And you liked my idea of Mexican Bauhaus.
Yes, I do, very much.
Mexican Bauhaus. Yeah, well, there's two reasons. Maybe there are more. One is that, Bauhaus was very, very rational and very function-oriented and had a very high-minded idea of bringing design to people that would thereby improve their lives because of the honesty of materials and of form. And that's sort of the designer's call to arms. Why are you designing this? Well, it's for you, But seriously, folks. So we were sort of fighting that, and I love Bauhaus. I mean, I was brought up, I love it, and so of course you're fighting something that you really adore. And the other thing was going to Mexico. I was shocked by how many international style buildings there were, and going, wait a minute, it isn't all just stucco or adobe sort of Alamos, and we got involved with this guy who was my helper's cousin, Pepe, and he was really wacky. I mean, that's another story. But he said, "Okay, I'm going to take you guys somewhere. I know this place. I don't know what it is." And he took us to Coyoacan. He didn't know anything about Frida or Diego, but there we were, and that stuff was all modernist. Was done by Juan O'Gorman. So you're going, Mexican Bauhaus.
Mexican Bauhaus. And your pieces reflect a lot of Bauhaus, but with a twist.
Yeah, that one's really got a twist in it. Yeah.
A real twist.
Yeah. Maybe the totem thing is kind of working, and I'm actually working on a book about towers because I realized I'm always making towers because they're for me, I don't know. You talked about Ettore, but he grew up in a place where there's nothing but towers, and they have one city where there's 100 of them.
Mm-hmm.
And but for me, it took off into an idea of transcendentalism and all that kind of stuff of uplifting. And there's where it's been. And then the metal teapots. The top one, the silver pot, is done for Cleto Munari.
Mm-hmm.
And this was very funny because it also comes into Ettore because I had met him, and then Aldo said, "We're going to my house this weekend, and we're going to go with Cleto then, and I know he's going to ask you to do a piece." So I said, "Okay." So I said, "What am I going to do?" And I looked around. There was an empty drafting board in the office. So I started drawing the pieces in a quasi-draftsman style with Pentel pens. It was really gross. And I started looking around, and all these people were doing these really fine pencils, these really beautiful, detailed things. And Ettore came along and stood there, and I go, "Oh, no, here we go." And he said, well, I showed him what I was doing, and I said, "Yeah, but I feel really bad that these guys' drawings are so good, and mine are just these clunky Pentel things." And he says, "Don't change anything." So we went to Cleto's, and he wasn't expecting me to be ready, but when I rolled out the drawings, he didn't quite know what to do. They were actually of these three pieces, but the one that on the top was one that I had thought of while I was in Italy, and it kind of come to me through that experience, and that's the one he responded to.
As I was looking at some of your metal work, I could see where you soldered pieces together, or where you've left the articulations rough. You could see the handmadeness of the object, and it made me think a lot of Bauhaus pieces by Mariana Brandt. We have some here in this collection. Her little tea strainers and
you can really see Brandt in
ashtrays.
the one on the left.
Yeah, the one on the left in particular. And it reminded me that the Bauhaus aspired to industrial production. They wanted to mass produce these things, but they started in the same place where you start, craft, handmade. You have to create the prototype somewhere, right?
I get into arguments with George Soden about that. He said, well, come on, we're making, he took that kind of line that we're doing this for the populace.
Right, right.
George is a real working class hero, and, right? And I'd say, no, come on, man, we're making these things 5 at a time, and they cost a lot of money. But some of the things find their way, don't they?
Yeah, sometimes the seed of the idea that has to be handmade and is expensive to produce does actually find its resolution in mass production. But to do that, it takes a lot of work, and it's not easy.
And it takes people being able to see it and want it.
Yeah, exactly.
Maybe getting used to it.
I was surprised by this piece because it seemed like you were interested in Fornasetti too, or Ginori, Ponti's ceramics from the 20s.
Yeah, I really love that stuff. Some of it's kind of commercial, but the stuff that he was doing with the balloons and everything, and one of the things that I noticed, I worked in a pottery in Deruta called Grazia, and I noticed that people really, in Italy, really love those moon faces. You see them everywhere. That kind of round face with a kind of, eyes, nose, mouth fit in it. So I really was, huh? Oh, I don't know what it means either. Do you know what it means?
No, just a pretty thing.
Yeah, it's the humanity or the human and human form. And so, I made my teapots with these kind of lift and painted, because I'd been painting the stuff. It was really funny because when I was in Deruta, the master painter was a kind of tough woman, and she painted my first prototypes. And then they use these brushes that are like, I don't know what they're like. They're like a very long brush, only they've got a bowl haircut around the base so that they hold a lot of paint, but they make a fine line, and they're really floppy. And I got the hang of using them, and I had them glaze up about 40 blanks, and they kind of gave me a look like, really, and they gave me a little Fiat 500. Oh, I was in heaven. So I'd go down at night and paint the things, and I got them all done, and they were just flabbergasted. And I understood why they raised their eyebrows, because they paint better when they're slightly wet. They start to chalk up when they get dry. But I managed, and this gal was so sort of pleased with me that she kissed me when I left. She said, he's leaving good.
I love this piece.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, Mexican Bauhaus. That's real Barragan-esque, isn't it?
Very Barragan.
Yeah, I was really into that way he had of flowing water and how ridiculous that would be as a teapot.
Working on a slightly different scale, sculpture and this pavilion in LA.
Yeah, and veering off into more straight sculpture. And the one on the left is, some kind of a machine that suggests movement, really moving into futurism and those kind of gestures. And then the one on the right is in Elysian Park, and it's a monument to the founders of the Save the Park Committee, who saved it many times. And it's a folly, a gazebo and a folly. And to make it quick, follies were garden structures usually done on English estates that were a little bit of a ramada or a getaway point, but they also held a social commentary through their shapes. And so this one, as you see, the city skyline talks about the city and the park and their relationship as sacred and profane, being reversed from the Greek.
I was surprised by your influences for these things. Albini and Moholy-Nagy.
My guy. Yeah, I saw that Albini and Domus. And that's the thing, is I saw, you asked, one of your questions was, did I know of Ettore? And I didn't know any of the names, because I'd seen Domus in school, in the library, but I couldn't read anything.
All in
I
Italian.
just knew it was great photos, and most of it was, kind of vertiginous. I'd go, which angle is this I'm looking at? And I saw this shelf in his house in an article, and I've been trying to imitate it ever since.
Yeah, it's spectacular.
Because I couldn't
shelf.
see quite what it was.
Yeah. And Moholy-Nagy with his light machines, these kind of
God.
kinetic
He makes me
sculptures from the
really mad.
1920s that would modulate light and movement, and another radical
Yeah,
design.
I hadn't seen any of that. I'd seen the compositions, the graphics, which I was really striving
So
for
the
all the
graphics
time.
were more.
Yeah, but they had the show at the county museum, and man, that thing, I was really upset because it was so good. You ever get that where you're just really upset because you're going, oh, the fucker.
I wanted to talk about your involvement with Memphis and how you got into it, what Milan was like in the 1980s. You described it as this kind of dusty, dirty place, hanging out at the bar Jamaica.
Yeah, it was kind of post-war. Were you there that early? 82. 82. So yeah, so you still got that. I mean, look at this place. You know this place like the back of your hand.
You hung out there too.
I walked past this place last time I was there, and I kept going back and forth because it's all glitzed up. Now it's like this. It was like this. That's my brother. We went. He and I went the first time. Ettore and I hamming it up in New Orleans.
In New Orleans.
Yeah. He was always ready. Christian particularly liked this because he's wearing such great shoes.
And the tie, too, the
And a
Memphis tie.
He always wore ties when we went to Milan the first time, everybody wore suits and ties. Yeah, except us, and they couldn't take their eyes off my brother. You imagine he went barefoot most of the time. So and that's Ettore in Los Angeles, and I always loved that, partly because he's so beatific, and the other is because, that was in like 82 or 3, and it's got that sandblasted plywood, which is the precursor of the Alpi wood, and then that just terrible picture of the Grand Canal, it's perfect.
Crooked and
Yeah.
but your interest in that plywood background and its the pattern that it makes was interesting.
Yeah, it
to
used
me.
to be in doctor's office all the time. It was like sort of signaled the worst.
I love that you had this picture.
Yeah, that one was the treasure. We've been going through them. You know what it is?
Is that the first show?
No, that's Alchemia.
Alchemia,
That's
Alchemia.
the basement. Alchemia was in the basement. Yeah, and that was an experience because that was like 1980, late 79, 80, and nobody was doing this stuff.
Right when Sottsass would have left Alchemia and
Just
started
after that.
Memphis.
Just after
because
that.
of a difference in opinion with Mendini, right? That Mendini sort of was into
What does
these
he do?
one-off productions, and Sottsass believed in unlimited production.
Well, I can only tell
This is
you
what I sort
what
of
I always heard
understood.
them saying. And they always said that Mendini was macabre.
Macabre.
Yeah. Which I,
Well, but there's a problem here because, so there was the Memphis collection that apparently you all thought was going to be mass produced, but there wasn't a million people that wanted that stuff in the 80s. So I think it was, I think
there
there
a
was
million now?
more of a, there was more of a problem than just how do we produce it at the right price point. It was also a problem of maybe 6 people in the world wanted one of those things
Yeah.
at any given time. So,
and
which
they're
is
all
good.
here today,
Yeah, we're all here today. 4 of us are here.
No, but it's all misguided. I mean, by the time I got there in '82, started working with Ettore, there still wasn't a single person with a business bone in their body, any way to be seen in any of these groups.
Except
So,
maybe Gismondi.
No.
You don't think so? What, he just sold his own work?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, in talking about Mendini, it might also be an Italian translation thing. 'Cause, to me, dealing over the last 30 plus years with Italians and this thing, I'm always realizing that I don't have a clue about what's happening, and I'm constantly finding out. And so, you speak Italian, and
Yeah, but I'm not going to trash talk Mendini.
no, it's not a question of it's not a question of trash talking him. I think what they meant was his philosophy was different, in that he believed that everything came from or was a rehash of something. And Ettore was always very interested in new. That was new and important were key words.
It's funny, I wish I knew what was going on at lunch. I don't know how many hours I sat through at lunch, and Castiglione and Mendini and, Magistretti and all these like famous people that I learned about in school, and they're all talking, but I couldn't understand a thing they were saying, so it was like...
It was probably, politics, or they weren't discussing business tips or, the latest materials. Usually it was,
But I have to tell the
food,
story
probably
of,
talking
of
about
me.
the food, actually.
Yeah. So we're at Ettore's favorite restaurant for lunch was Torre di Pisa. We were always at Torre di Pisa. Fantastic. And if you hang with somebody like Ettore who was sensitive to this, the food was spectacular. And so I was... all these luminaries were having lunch, and again, I couldn't understand what was going on. And, but I was gushing about how good the food was. And Ettore kind of got tired of me gushing, like, well, come on. And he said to me, well, what would you have for lunch? And I couldn't tell him that, that I would wolf something down on my desk or in the car on the way to the next meeting, because he started worrying about lunch about 10:30 and who was going to come, and it was 2 hours long, and so I just couldn't admit that I wolfed down something in the car. So I said, the story. So I said, well, I would have had a tuna melt, escalating my lunch to a tuna melt.
Had to be prepared.
Yeah, prepared, yeah. So he said to me, what's a tuna melt? And I said, well, you get a can of tuna. And he looked at me with such disgust. and he said, fish in a can? He'd never seen it. And anyways, and I said, then you take a piece of cheese and put it over top of the fish. And he looked more disgusted and he said, cheese on fish? Anyway, the best part of that story is, so in those days when I was building my house, it was done by faxes. This was before the internet, right? So everything was a fax. I have a stack of faxes. It's that tall. Anyways, but his pet name for me after that day was Tuna Melt. So I have all these original faxes, and they all start out, Dear Tuna Melt. And then there's a bunch of shit about the house. And then at the bottom, he always signed them the same way. Super love, Ettore. I haven't got the guts. I'm going to start signing it instead of all the best. I'm going to start signing it super love, comma.
Tuna melt.
Tuna melt.
That was my last question to all of you, that food was something that was really important to Ettore, and to most Italians, it's in the culture. He did this autobiographical design on the screen, 4 pages of it, but one whole section is about food, very simple, that he likes spaghetti with tomato and garlic, green vegetables, good oil and vinegar, just the simplicity and that's sort of his design as well. There's a simplicity to it. Yeah. Do you have a favorite story of like going to a meal with Ettore and what happened there?
So this is what I think. I think food was a vehicle for socialization for him. So we had many, many, many late night dinners at his house, with half the studio or a client that happened to be in town or friends coming in, or even at my house. And the thing I remember the most was, and I actually see a few people who have been to these dinners out here, what would happen was you'd make something very simple, not a lot of fuss, the fewer ingredients, but good ingredients, the right olive oil, the right garlic, the right whatever. Simple presentation, and people would eat it. And as they ate, they would normally talk about a different meal that someone had. And they'd discuss recipe. You'd be serving pasta, and they'd be discussing the recipe for, something else. And it's very interesting Italians do that. Then after a certain point, there was always a lot of drinking, and usually it was a bottle per head by the end of the night. Then I would see that if Ettore was having fun, and everyone was kind of having fun, and this is kind of an amazing thing, I can't imagine this happening now, someone would ask me for like a pad of sketch paper. Do you have paper? And so I started keeping it close by with colors. And I'd take it out, and people would start drawing, and Ettore would start drawing, and friends would start just kind of while they're talking and drinking, and they usually went on pretty late at night, just kind of drawing things. And if instead the evening was going the other way, it would turn into what David said, a big fight about something completely ridiculous. Usually it was some kind of political nuance, you know, and you'd think, oh my God, these, you know, no one's going to ever speak to each other again. And by the next morning, it was like, you know, ciao, come va, how's it going? Everyone was happy. So for me, when I think of food in Ettore, I think this whole social aspect of it, the whole kind of ritual of it, and it ending well, and ending whatever, you know, people dancing, getting up. It was a very open thing. And his house as well, his own apartment with Barbara was designed in a way where it was very easy to be mobile. He didn't have, well, you have it in your house. He gave you this kind of layout too. You don't have the two sofas with the coffee table in the middle and this sort of formal presentation where you go from the dining room table and then you go sit in the living room, because that totally ruins the dinner when you do that. Instead, he had, you know, an open table and then a few sofas scattered around. Everything was on wheels. The armchairs were on wheels. The little tables were on, excuse me, wheels. And so people would kind of naturally at a certain point get up, go look at, you know, grab a book from the bookshelf, or someone would be changing the music. And it was this very kind of free-spirited, open exchange of friendship, in a way, of love, even when it was in a fight.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Do you still have the drawings?
Yeah,
All right.
of course.
Talk to Christian.
Joanna cooks like this, so you're all welcome over to Joanna's house.
What I think of as I thought about it is the first time I had lunch with him. He showed up at my studio with Barbara, and we talked a little bit. And he said, you know, let's go to lunch. And I knew a Chinese restaurant that was Mandarin, not the usual chop suey. So we went there. And on the way, we go past this house that's typical stucco with a sort of a typical southwestern kind of valance on it, and it has this addition that's right out of modernism with this kind of thrusting, candid roofs. And I'd always looked at it, and it's, you know, driven by it thousands of times, and nobody ever said anything. And he looked at it and he said, "Oh, look at that." And I thought, oh yeah, this guy sees everything. And so we had a great lunch. We came back, and we're coming past that place again. And he said, well, these things we're doing are very political. And I thought, well, my parents were very political, and it took the form of you know, formal protests and marches and stuff. And I said, well, how is it how is it political? And he said, well, what if everyone peed in the ocean at the same time? Which I'm still trying to figure out. And we got back, and we were feeling very good as it was. And I was thinking, I was working up the courage to say to him, what if I come to Italy? And he looked at me and said, when will you be in Italy? That's him.
One thing I'm sure we're done, but the one thing about Ettore is when you travel with him, Joanna can tell you this, when you travel with him, you know, Americans are trying to get from A to B. You know, I'm like, I don't want to stop and look at the Grand Canyon. I'm trying to get to Tucson, you know, so why would you stop? He stopped, what, every 12 seconds? He could never get anywhere very fast because he wanted to take a picture.
I was telling David about having a trip in India, and we had to go like 12 hours to get somewhere. And, you know, you have a driver, and you're in there. And we'd just be driving along these dirt roads, really small, and he'd just be screaming at the driver, stop! And you know, what's going on? He'd pull over, and he'd see in the distance some little house. And in fact, some of the photographs I think might be in the show. Mm-hmm. This little tiny house, and he'd, you know, get into these people's front yard, and he'd take those pictures. So it was like no inconvenience was too much, but in that way, he was really seeing things, and he was really kind of capturing them. But, you know, and I was like, you can't, you know, quit telling, you shouldn't tell, I wouldn't say that, of course, but I think you shouldn't tell him to stop this poor guy, you know. But instead, you know, they start to get it, and then they'd start pulling over, you know, should I stop here? And he's like, no, not here, because of course they wouldn't have the same criteria. So.
Thank you all for putting some flesh onto the bones of the exhibition and really explaining who Sottsass was as a person. I appreciate you all being here, and thank you all for coming.